Hi, hey guys, welcome back, and we're going to do chapter 34. So, excuse me. Chapter 34, page 152. The sun was almost directly overhead. He figured he could walk far for no more than another hour, maybe 2, before he had to turn back. It seemed pointless. He could see there was nothing ahead of him, nothing but emptiness. He was hot, tired, hungry, and most of all, thirsty. Maybe he should just turn around now. Maybe he'd already gone halfway and didn't know it. Then he looked around. He saw a pool of water less than 100 yards away from where he was standing. He closed his eyes and opened them to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The pool was still there. He hurried toward it. The pool hurried away from him, moving as he moved and stopping when he stopped. There wasn't any water. It was a mirage caused by the shimmering waves of heat rising off the dry ground. A mirage is when you imagine something that's not actually there. It happens to people in the desert. And if you've ever been somewhere that's really, really hot and you look and you kind of can see different things, right? It's the heat messing with your eyesight, basically. Anyway, here we go. He kept walking. He still carried the empty sack of sunflower seeds. He didn't know if he might find something to put in it. After a while, he thought he could make out the shape of the mountains through the haze. At first, he wasn't sure if this was another kind of mirage, but the farther he walked, the clearer they came into view. Almost straight ahead of him, he could see what looked like a fist with its thumb sticking up. He didn't know how far away it was. 5 miles, 50 miles. One thing was certain. It was more than halfway. He kept walking toward it, although he didn't know why. He knew he'd have to turn around before he got there. But every time he looked at it, it seemed to encourage him, giving him the thumbs up sign. As he continued walking, he became aware of the large object on the lake. He couldn't tell what it was, or even if it was natural or man-made. It looked like a fallen tree, although it didn't seem likely that a tree would grow here. More likely, it was a ridge of dirt or rocks. The object, or whatever it was not on the way to the big thumb, but off to the right. He tried to decide whether to go to it or to continue towards the big thumb, or maybe just turn around. There was no point in heading towards Big Thumb, he decided. He would never make it. For all he knew, it was like chasing the moon. But he could make it to the mysterious object. He changed directions, and he doubted it was anything. But the fact was that there was something in the middle of all of this, nothing, and it made it hard for him to pass it up. He decided to make the object his halfway point, and he hoped he hadn't already gone too far. He laughed to himself when he saw what it was. It was a boat, or part of a boat anyway. It struck him as funny to see a boat in the middle of this dry, barren wasteland. But after all, he realized this was once a lake. The boat lay upside down, half buried in the dirt. Someone may have drowned here, he thought grimly, at the same spot where he could very well die of thirst. The name of the boat had been painted on the back. The upside-down red letters were peeled and faded, but Stanley could read the name, Mary Lou. Now think really hard. Who had a boat called the Mary Lou? And who may or may not have been shot in the middle of this lake and died? Okay. On one side of the boat, there was a pile of dirt and then a tunnel leading down below the boat. The tunnel looked big enough for a good-sized animal to crawl through. He heard a noise. Something stirred under the boat. It was coming out. Hey! Stanley shouted, hoping to scare it back inside. His mouth was very dry, and it was hard to shout very loudly. Hey! The thing answered very weakly. Then a dark hand and an orange sleeve reached up out of the tunnel. All right, without looking at the next page, who do you think it is? Hey! You got it right, it's Zero. Zero's face looked like a jack-o'-lantern that had been left out too many days past Halloween, half rotted with sunken eyes and a drooping smile. Is that water? He asked. His voice was weak and raspy. His lips were so pale they were almost white, and his tongue seemed to flop around uselessly in his mouth as he spoke, as if he kept getting in the way. It's empty, said Stanley. and he stared at Zero, not quite believing that it was real. I tried to bring you the whole water truck, but... He smiled sheepishly. Oh, guys, I can't turn the page. He smiled sheepishly. I drove it into a hole. I can't believe you're... Me either, said Zero. Come on, we gotta get back to camp. Zero shook his head. I'm not going back. You have to. We both have to. You want some sploosh? Zero asked. What? Zero shaded his eyes with his forearm. It's cooler under the boat, he said. Stanley watched Zero crawl back through his hole. It was a miracle he was still alive. But Stanley knew he would have had to give him back to camp soon, even if he had to carry him. He crawled after him, and he was just able to squeeze his body through the hole. He never would have fit when he first came to Camp Green Lake, but he had lost a lot of weight. As he pulled himself through, his leg struck something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. For a second, Stanley wondered how it got there. Then he remembered that Zero had taken it with him after striking Mr. Pendanski. It was cooler under the boat, which was half buried in the dirt. There were enough cracks and holes in the bottom of the boat, and now the roof to provide light and ventilation. He could see empty jars scattered about. Zero held a jar in his hand and grunted as he tried to unscrew the lid. What is it? Sploosh. His voice was strained as he worked on the jar. That's what I call it. They were buried under the boat. He still couldn't get the lid off. I found 16 jars. Here, hand me the shovel. Stanley didn't have a lot of room to move, but he reached behind him, grabbed the wooden end of the shovel, and held it out to Zero, blade first. Sometimes you just have to, Zero said, and then he hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the top of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth and licked the sploosh off the jagged edges before it spilled. Careful, Stanley warned. Zero picked up the cracked lid and licked the sploosh off that as well. Then he handed the broken jar to Stanley. Drink some. Stanley held it in his hand and stared at it a moment. He was afraid of the broken glass, and he was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized, it must have been in the boat when the boat sank. That meant it was probably over 100 years old. Who knew what kind of bacteria might be living in that? It's good, said Zero, encouraging him. He wondered if Zero had heard of bacteria. He raised the jar to his mouth and carefully took a sip. It was warm, bubbly, mushy nectar, sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven as it flowed over his dry mouth and down his parched throat. He thought it might have been some kind of fruit at some time. Perhaps peaches. Zero smiled at him. I told you it was good. They passed the jar back and forth. Oh, Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. How many are left? He asked. None, said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. Now I have to take you back, he said. I'm not digging any more holes, said Zero. They won't make you dig. They'll probably send you to a hospital like Barf Bag. Barf Bag stepped on a rattlesnake, said Zero. Stanley remembered how he'd almost done the same. I guess he didn't hear the rattle. He did it on purpose, said Zero. You think? He took off his shoe and sock first. Stanley shivered as he tried to imagine it. What's Merya-lu-la-u? Asked Zero. What? Merya-la-u. I have no idea. I'll show you, said Zero. He crawled back from under the boat. Stanley followed. Back outside, he had to shield his eyes from the brightness. Merya-la-u. Stanley smiled. Mary Lou. It's the name of the boat. Mary Lou. I thought the Y made the Y sound. It does, but not when it's at the end of a word. Sometimes Y is just a vowel, and sometimes it's a consonant. Zero suddenly groaned. He grabbed his stomach and bent over. Are you all right? Zero dropped to the ground, and he lay on his side with his knees pulled up to his chest. He continued to groan. Stanley watched helplessly. He wondered if it was the last sploosh, if it was the sploosh. He looked back toward Camp Green Lake. At least he thought it was the direction of Camp Green Lake. He wasn't entirely sure. Zero stopped moaning and his body slowly unbent. I'm taking you back, said Stanley. Zero managed to sit up, and he took several deep breaths. Look, I got a plan so you won't get into much trouble, Stanley assured him. Remember when I found the gold tube? Remember I gave it to X-Ray and the warden went crazy making us dig where she thought X-Ray found it? I think if I tell the warden where I really found it, I think she'll let us off. I'm not going back, said Zero. We've got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He had come to rescue Zero instead drank the last of his sploosh. He looked off in the distance. I want you to look at something. I just want you to look at the mountain up there. See the one that has something sticking off of it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing. But as he studied the mountain, his right hand slowly formed into a fist. He raised his thumb, and his eyes went from the mountain to his hand, then back to the thumb. Back to the mountain. All right, so where do you think they're going? Okay, go ahead and do your vocabulary and your summaries, and then please go check Teams to see what questions you need to answer for this story. All right, bye.